Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Across State Lines. I'm your host, Danielle. Thank you so much for tuning in for episode 15 of the podcast, where today we will be discussing the 2003 disappearance of 66-year-old June Goodman out of Snowflake, Arizona. In March of 2003, June Goodman had gone for dinner with her sister Pat in the small town of Snowflake before heading to a local supermarket for some candy to have as dessert. June then went back to her home, which she lived at alone after the death of her husband a few years prior, and settled in on the couch in the living room to watch some television. The next morning, June hadn't shown up for her job at the post office, and employees contacted her sister to see where she was. Worried, her sister made her way to June's home only to find it empty, with the TV still on. Worry grew for both family and investigators when it came to light that a man along June's postal route had previously threatened her life prior to her disappearance, and how that same man went on to be the prime suspect in the murder of another man in the town of Snowflake. This resident wasn't the only suspect, however. There were 40 potential suspects that authorities had to narrow down, including one TV repairman who had made June feel very uncomfortable during a prior incident. However, before we jump into the case, I would like to remind everybody that Across State Lines is available on all podcast streaming platforms, such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and anywhere else that you might listen. If you are liking Across State Lines and would like to leave us a rating, a review, or a follow, it would be greatly appreciated. If you want to leave us any feedback, go to our website and send us an email. Thank you so much for listening. And now, let's jump into the case of June Goodman. June Johnson Goodman was a 66-year-old woman living in Snowflake, Arizona, before she suddenly disappeared one spring evening in 2003. She had been born on June 4th, 1936, and was raised in the quaint town of Snowflake, located southwest of the Petrified National Forest in northern Arizona. June spent her whole life in northern Arizona, and she raised her 5 children in Snowflake as well. In 2003, June was incredibly excited to start the next phase of her life, as she was just about to retire from her long-standing job at the US Postal Service and had begun to make plans on what came next for her life. June's daughter, Dawnette, had described her mother as someone who was always cheerful and always saw the positive in everyone and everything, and people were drawn in by her warm and endearing personality. Dawnette recalls her mother fondly, stating that June always made everyone around her feel so special, saying to the White Mountain Independent News, quote, "She always made other people happy and always put everyone else first. She was always cheerful, bubbly, and had a great outlook. At every family event, she is in our memory." End quote. June was well respected in her community, and was well known by the residents of Snowflake. June was not only the mother to her 5 children, she was also the grandmother to 19 grandchildren and great-grandmother to 25 great-grandchildren, some of which were born after her disappearance. June's daughter, Eva Hawkins, spoke about June's disappearance and how she didn't have the opportunity to meet all of her great-grandchildren, stating to a news source, quote, "They never got a chance to know her. I think about my mother every day. Sometimes I just get so angry for a while. I also feel sorry for myself when I hear people talking about doing things with their mother. I think it's not fair. It wasn't her time to go. When I'm around my family, I'm okay, but when I'm by myself, like in the car, I start crying." End quote. Dawnette also had spoken of her mother to the local media after her disappearance, saying, quote, "The most important things to my mom were her faith, her family, and her friends. She was a solid citizen and a warm person who everyone liked." End quote. On the evening of March 28, 2003, June Goodman met up with her sister, Pat Fawcett, to have dinner. During this dinner, June excitedly told Pat about how she was looking forward to her upcoming retirement and the plans she was beginning to make for her free time. The pair spent the time in each other's company until about 8 p.m., when June decided it was time to leave and head home. However, June had fancied something sweet to end off the evening and made a stop into Ed's Market for some candy. She browsed the aisles for a bit, taking a bit of time to find the perfect dessert for the evening, before settling on 4 chocolate bars and bringing them to the register. Once purchased, June left the store around 8:25 p.m. It's unclear where June might have gone next, but it is suspected that after leaving Ed's Market, she made her way directly back to her home. Her ranch-style house was located at the end of a quarter-mile dirt road, and she had lived there for years. June had become a widow several years earlier and now lived at the residence by herself after the death of her husband. Despite living alone, June always felt very safe within her community and didn't feel as if she had anything to fear, for the most part. Once June got into her house, she settled in to watch some TV and eat her chocolate bars before heading to sleep for the night. She was scheduled to work the next morning, March 29th, but when her shift rolled around, she never showed up at the post office to collect the daily mail that she was to deliver. This deeply concerned June's coworkers, as she was a very reliable employee who often arrived early to work to prepare for her deliveries. June's coworkers called her home to check on her, but when they failed to reach her, they phoned June's sister, Pat. Once Pat learned about her sister's unusual absence, she immediately got in her car and drove to June's home. Pat knew it wasn't like June to not show up to work, and her worry grew as she drove towards the house at the end of the dirt road. Once Pat arrived at June's home, she was quite alarmed right off the bat. The sliding glass door which led to the backyard had been left half open, and June's work van was still parked in its normal spot. The outside lights also had been left on overnight, which Pat found unusual as her sister would typically turn them off before turning in for bed. Once she entered the home, she found the television had been left on and June's purse was sitting on the counter, but there was no sign of anyone home. Even all of June's shoes were accounted for, meaning that however June left her home, she had left her house barefoot or in socks. This was enough for Pat to contact the Snowflake Police Department, who immediately arrived on scene. Both the Snowflake Police Department and Navajo County Sheriff's Office became involved from the start. June wasn't just a beloved member of the community. She was also related to U.S. Representative Jeff Flake and State House Speaker Jake Flake, two prominent members of the GOP in Arizona. Police were feeling the pressure to solve this case in a timely manner, though they quickly concluded that her relations to these politicians was in no way related to her disappearance. Robbery was also ruled out as a motive, as nothing had appeared to be missing from the home. All of her jewelry, her purse and her wallet, and other valuable items were all accounted for. Police looked at the scene closely to piece together what might have happened that evening. They noted that it appeared June had been sitting in her recliner and was watching TV directly before she vanished. They also noted that where this recliner was positioned lent a great view of the long dirt road leading up to her home. They theorized that perhaps June had seen headlights approaching and had opened the back sliding glass door in order to greet someone. They suspected that since the back door was left half open until morning, that June never went back into her house once she stepped out. There were no signs of a struggle either inside the home or outside of it. This led authorities to believe that June may have gotten into a vehicle willingly, either to have a conversation or to go to another location. They also noticed that there were no footprints in the dirt outside her home, making it impossible to determine which direction June may have walked after she left the back door. A search was quickly put on for the missing woman, which included dogs, searchers on foot, and helicopters. The search spanned miles in either direction, yet no sign of June was uncovered. A spokesperson for the sheriff's office made a statement saying that it almost appeared as if June stepped foot outside her back door and vanished into thin air. They were at a total loss. Within days of June's disappearance, Authorities announced that they believed this was the case of an abduction. However, they did not state what led them to believe this. Within the first month of the investigation, over 300 people had been interviewed by police, some of these interviews being with coworkers of June. This is when they learned of an angry postal customer by the name of Patrick Michael Kahn, who had made threats against June the year prior. 43-year-old Patrick had been a regular customer of June's for years on her rural postal route, and he lived to the east of Snowflake. At the time, the US Postal Service had begun to refuse delivery of mail to customers if they did not use the designated address assigned to their home. And this angered a lot of customers, Patrick included. Patrick continuously refused to use his designated home address for his mail, and June continuously refused to deliver his mail. This led to an angry, heated confrontation between the two, which scared June enough to speak to her supervisor and put in a formal written complaint about Patrick, so his name would remain on file. When Patrick realized that his outburst wasn't enough to fix the situation, he decided to go a step further. He drove to the post office and let a handful of June's co-workers know that he was going to kill her. Naturally, this frightened June immensely, telling her sister that she was deathly afraid of the man, and for very good reason. Patrick had recently been the prime suspect in another murder. Shortly after Patrick threatened June, in February of 2002, Patrick had become the prime suspect in the murder of Donald Sewell. Donald had been shot with a Russian-made semi-automatic rifle and left to die, slumped over his vehicle off of Highway 77. He had been shot a total of 13 times. The murder of Donald was the first homicide the town of Snowflake had seen in decades, and Patrick came under the radar as a suspect when it was discovered that he was trying to sell a similar gun shortly after the homicide. Patrick had fled Arizona after the shooting, but authorities assumed that he had returned to his hometown in Ohio. However, they did not discount the possibility that Patrick actually remained in the state, never having left, and was possibly responsible for the abduction and murder of June as well. Authorities thought that they had found Patrick shortly after the murder of Donald Sewell, when they were notified by New Mexico authorities that Patrick had been arrested and detained for shoplifting in Espanola. Sadly, as Navajo County police officials had begun the extradition process to bring Patrick back to Arizona, they were informed by New Mexico police that there had been a mix-up. The last name of the man they had arrested for shoplifting in Espanola had the same last name. However, it was spelled differently and not the same Patrick Kahn that Arizona authorities had been searching for. They had sent a photo of the inmate in custody to Navajo County Sheriff's Office to confirm, and the detectives there positively said that despite the two men having similar birthdays and similar names, the man in the photo was not the Patrick Kahn they had been looking for. Then, in September of 2003, they located Patrick hiding out in Columbus, Ohio. They extradited him back to Arizona to face earlier charges on 7 counts of child molestation. He never faced charges in the death of Donald Sewell, and it is unclear if that murder ever had a resolution. They also determined that Patrick was in Columbus at the time of June's disappearance. With this, and no evidence linking him, he was never charged in the abduction of June, but police did keep him listed as a person of interest in the case. Patrick was charged in the child molestation case and sentenced to serve 21 years in prison. Another potential suspect came on the radar of investigators, an unnamed TV repairman who had worked on June's television about a month prior to her disappearance. Her sister stated that after the repairs, June continued to have issues with her TV and expressed that she had been very unhappy with the repairs. Pat had suggested that June call the repairman back in order to complete the job, but June refused, telling her sister that the man gave her an uneasy feeling and she did not want to be around him again. They had interviewed this man while he was in jail for unrelated drug charges, but they were unable to uncover anything that would lead them to believe that he had been involved in June's disappearance. The family didn't want June's name and story to fade from the memory of town residents, and they put up a $100,000 reward for any information that would lead to a resolution in her case. They also placed a handful of billboards around the town to continue to keep her memory alive and her disappearance as a priority. Despite this, the case went cold, and by the end of 2003, it had faded from headlines completely. The family held a memorial service for June in 2008, coming to terms with the fact that she was most likely no longer alive, but wanting to celebrate her life. This brought little closure to the family, however, as they still don't have answers as to what happened that day in March of 2003. June Goodman's case is still open, but detectives have admitted that it is no longer an active investigation. They stated that the lack of witnesses to what happened that night severely hindered the investigation, and they have no idea if June left voluntarily or if she had been abducted and killed, but they do lean towards the latter. There have been 40 possible suspects for the abduction of June Goodman at the start of the investigation, but as the search went on, the authorities were able to whittle that number down to 5 or 6. Sadly, though, there has never been a resolution 21 years later. A detective on the case spoke about the standstill in June's possible abduction, saying, quote, "We have been brainstorming hundreds of scenarios. When you don't have a single piece of evidence or a good suspect, that's about all you can do." End quote. When last seen, June was described as standing at 5'2" and weighing 130 pounds. She had brown, gray hair and green eyes. She was last seen wearing a light purple sweatsuit, but she may have changed her clothes when she got home. She was believed to have been barefoot or wearing socks when she disappeared. If alive today, June would be 88 years old. Now, let's dive into the theories of this case, of which we seem to be working with very little. We know that June safely made it back to her home the evening of March 28th, as her work van was parked in its normal spot. June's purse was sitting on the counter, and her TV had been left on. The fact that June's sliding glass door was left ajar could signal to the fact that she willingly opened it and allowed whoever was outside the home inside. But it also could have been left unlocked, and whoever had driven to June's house that night could have snuck in themselves. However, I find this unlikely, as June's chair was facing the direction of the glass door, and she most likely would have seen someone approaching if someone was trying to let themselves in. There is always the chance that the glare of the TV on the glass door prevented June from actually seeing outside, though. Someone could have approached, and she may not have seen them until it was too late. I lean towards the idea that whatever had taken place that night happened outside the home. There weren't any signs of a struggle inside of June's house, and she hadn't taken her shoes with her to go anywhere. I tend to believe that whoever showed up at her home that night, she had seen approaching, and she stepped outside in her socks to speak to them, whether she felt safe to do so or not. I imagine that some sort of verbal altercation ensued, and June was forced to leave her home under duress. We don't have a lot of suspects to work with, at least not many that are known publicly. The TV repairman was considered a suspect by police and the media, but it doesn't feel like this holds a lot of weight. It seems that not much was said between the repairman and June after her TV was repaired, as June refused to reach back out to the man, despite her sister pressing her to get it resolved. June told her sister that the man made her feel uncomfortable and uneasy, but it has never been released to the media exactly why this might be. I would be curious to know exactly what happened that made June feel so uneasy in his presence. Did he make some sort of sexual comment or advance towards her? Was it just some sort of sense or intuition that June had that made her instinctively uncomfortable around him? Was he just rude or unhelpful? Unfortunately, we will never know the answer to that question. The man did have a record for drug charges, but I don't see how that would fit into the theory that he had abducted June, and the police didn't feel that there was any evidence against him that would point in that direction either. Next, we have the theory that June wasn't abducted at all and that she had left her home that night on her own accord. This feels like the most implausible theory, but one that at least needs to be discussed. We know that June had a lot to look forward to. Her retirement was coming up, and she would be receiving a nice pension for it. She was actively making plans on how she wanted to spend her retirement, and she had a lot of friends and family and a community who loved her. I don't particularly feel that June would have left her life behind or had taken her own life. But then again, you never truly know what someone is dealing with. It is said that many people who take their own lives will have something they are looking forward to on the horizon, and that friends and loved ones are often blindsided to hear of their loved one's self-inflicted death. June did lose her husband a few years before she went missing, and that could have potentially affected her mental health in a lot of ways. But I do feel if June had taken her own life somewhere out in the forest surrounding Snowflake, she would have been found by now. We know June didn't take her car, so it's impossible that she could have made it very far on foot. If there was some reason June left her home that day due to a medical condition affecting her judgment, I feel the same thing about her body being found within the last 21 years. To me, this theory seems the most unlikely to have happened. Next, we have the theory that Patrick Kahn played a role in her disappearance and probable death. And there is a lot to back up this theory, but some detracting pieces of information as well. Patrick and June had gotten into a verbal altercation more than once, as June refused to deliver his mail because he refused to use his home address as the delivery address. This escalated into Patrick going into the post office and threatening June's life in front of her coworkers and other employees. On top of that, Patrick had been the prime suspect of a murdered man shortly after he threatened June, the prime suspect in the shooting of Donald Sewell, who was shot 13 times and left to die on Highway 77. We don't know the circumstances that led to Patrick possibly killing Donald, but is it possible that Patrick was on some sort of revenge rampage against people he perceived as wronging him, starting with Donald and then moving on to June before he left the state? On top of murder, Patrick already had charges against him for molestation of a child that he was facing prison time over. Perhaps Patrick felt that he had nothing left to lose facing those charges and made good on his threats to June before attempting to leave the state. I wonder if Patrick waited nearby June's house the night she went to dinner with her sister, waiting for her to come home, and began to approach the sliding glass door of her home when she spotted him. Perhaps in an attempt to not allow him in, June stepped outside in her socks to see what he wanted, and an altercation ensued. Perhaps he had the same gun that he allegedly used to kill Donald Sewell, and used it to force June into his own car, where he drove her somewhere further away before killing her. I do find it odd that the MOs would be different in both cases. If he killed June, he took her away from her home before killing her and successfully hid her body somewhere for the last 21 years. Whereas with Donald, if he killed him on site and left his body there, with no attempt to cover it up. But despite these differences, I do feel like Patrick is the most likely person to have been involved in June's disappearance, and unfortunately, most likely took her life that March night in 2003. He had the motive and the means. I'd like to know if the authorities had ever offered Patrick some sort of deal in order to get more information out of him about June's case, like reducing his sentence on his other charges if he would provide the location of June's body. If they did, it seems like he either outright denied involvement in her case or didn't take their bait. Now, the one very important thing that severely takes away the likelihood of Patrick being involved in June's disappearance is the fact that police determined he was in Ohio at the time of her death. If that is 100% accurate, then clearly Patrick was not the one to have killed June. But I would like to know how police came to that determination and if they are absolutely certain that it was the case. We do have some lazy police work in this time and area with the Navajo County Sheriff's Office and the Snowflake Police Department, as Patrick wasn't ever seriously investigated in the case of Donald Sewell, despite him attempting to sell a very similar and very unique gun shortly after the murder. I wonder if it's possible that Patrick simply told the authorities that he was in Ohio at the time, or had a friend or family member back that claim up, but they didn't press him further or really dive into his alibi. However, if they did truly confirm his whereabouts on March 28th, 2003, and he was in Ohio, it doesn't exclude the possibility that he could have hired someone to have June abducted or killed and had been in Ohio to have a solid alibi. Sadly, after 2 decades passing and the case no longer being actively investigated, it feels like whatever happened to June Goodman may remain a mystery until the right person comes forward. I can only hope that one day that will happen, so her 5 kids and numerous grandchildren and great grandchildren can find peace in knowing what happened to their beloved mother and grandmother. If you have any information about the disappearance of June Goodman, please call Snowflake Taylor Police Department at 928 536 7500. Before we end this episode off, I would like to make a small announcement. One of my most valuable resources for researching cases, and one of the most put together and important missing persons databases, the Charlie Project, is in need of some help. The Charlie Project was founded in 2004 by a sole woman named Megan Good, and Megan has tirelessly kept up the database for the last 20 years, with only the help of her husband. During this time, they have entered over 16,000 missing persons cases into the database. Many writers and researchers like myself use the Charlie Project near daily as a source for case information, and the database itself has gone on to solve many missing persons cases over the years. In fact, I have used it recently to try to identify a John Doe that had been found in Goodyear, Arizona this past January. And thanks to the Charlie Project, I am almost certain I've made a positive match. However, I am still waiting to hear back from the police department if the DNA from the John Doe matches the missing person I had found on the Charlie Project. Megan is asking for donations to continue to run the Charlie Project, whether it be a one-time donation or a monthly subscription of whatever you can afford. It will help her keep this amazing site running and keep the names of missing persons alive. I've personally just donated, and I'm hoping if you're able to, you'll consider donating as well. It takes a special person to volunteer their time to keep the names and memories of missing people alive, and I appreciate all that Megan has done. Thank you so much for considering, and thank you so much for listening to episode 15 of Across State Lines. Thank you so much for listening to Across State Lines, and we will be back next week to dive into another unsolved case. Please follow or subscribe to Across State Lines on your podcast listening platform so that way new episodes will drop directly into your listening feed. If you'd like to rate or review Across State Lines on whatever platform you listen to, it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much, and join us again next week.